Hello and welcome as we continue these mini Bible studies, preparing for the 8th Sunday after Pentecost, July the 18th, 2021. Today we'll be looking at the Gospel according to St. Mark in the 6th chapter, verses 30 through 34, and then jumping over some verses and picking up again at 53 through 56. So let me first read for you the introduction to the Gospel, then the Gospel reading itself, and share with you some reflections that I've gathered for today. When Jesus sends his disciples out to teach and heal, they minister among larger numbers of people. Their work is motivated by Christ's desire to be among those in need. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored the boat. When they got out of the boat, people at once recognized him and rushed about that whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. The first part of today's reading immediately follows the story of the execution of John the Baptist by King Herod at the whim of a little girl, probably around 12 years old, because her mother had a grudge against John the Baptist. And verse 29 reminds us from last week's gospel, when John's disciples heard about it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb. Then, without preamble, verse 30 tells us, the apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. I think this might qualify as the worst segue ever. Mark could have given us a little bit of something in between those two events. Yet it does tell us that as John's mission was ending, the mission of Jesus in this world and the disciples is catching on fire. Jesus intends for a little getaway, if you will, for his disciples, because the text says many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. If there's anything that we Lutherans understand, or at least me is eating. I often say about church events that if we feed them, they will come. The disciples spread the good news about God's kingdom and Jesus, and great crowds, it says, hurried there on foot from all the towns to see and to hear Jesus. Jesus' disciples started something when they went out 2 by 2, and now it has exploded into great crowds. Jesus tries to get the disciples away for a little time of refreshment and renewal, yet the crowds follow. The good news, when properly shared, will grow the church exponentially. I once spoke before a group of people about mission and vision. And I used similar words to those that the spread of the gospel will grow the church exponentially. And I overheard someone in the back of the room say, "I hope that never happens here." It made me wonder, how many people will not talk with others about Jesus because they do not want their particular congregation to change and grow? Now, many other reasons can be given for not sharing one's faith story, yet I wonder how many are afraid that their church might change with whatever great crowds will come and see Jesus. Today's reading teaches us that there is a great hunger for the good news of God's kingdom that Jesus brought. Verse 30 tells us that the disciples had great success in all their preaching and teaching. Jesus recognizes that they need a period of refreshment and renewal in order to be able to continue this mission, this work that he has laid before them. So he loads them into a boat in order to find this place where they can have a retreat and they can be renewed. And then verse 33 tells us, "Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them." The mission was expanding. The teaching and preaching brought great crowds. That's shown in verse 30, where the disciples are telling Jesus about all that they had taught and done, and flocks of crowds of people are coming. Many consistently making the effort to track Jesus down wherever he went. And in this case, it tells us many people hurried to get to where Jesus was going and arrived ahead of Jesus and the disciples. I'm not sure that this image comes through strong enough in these short verses, today's reading. So imagine with me for a moment, if you will, Jesus and the disciples get in a boat and they travel across the lake by boat, likely the shortest distance between 2 points. Yet, the people are literally running. That's the word in the Greek, not hurried. Hurried sounds like, oh, we better get going, let's get all our stuff together. They're running around the shoreline. And they're getting across to the other side faster than the boat traveled, the shortest distance between 2 lines. And it tells us it was people from all the towns. It wasn't just some, it was great crowds. Today's reading tells us that Jesus viewed these crowds to be like sheep without a shepherd. You know, I think in this 21st century USA, we might tend to read right past that without giving it a second thought. Yet, the number one criticism of political leaders of Israel throughout the Old Testament, throughout the gospel readings, is that they have been terrible shepherds. This is the connection to Sunday's first reading from Jeremiah. Chapter 23, verse 1 reads, "Woe to the shepherds who destroy and scatter the sheep of my pasture, says the Lord." Now, we need to not read that literally. This is not about actual sheep and actual shepherds. The sheep in these messages are a metaphor for the people, and the shepherds are a metaphor for the political leaders. In last week's gospel, the story just prior to today's reading in Mark 6, we're told that King Herod gave a banquet for his courtiers, which is a synonym for flatterers, and officers and the leaders of Galilee. Jesus looks upon the people for whom King Herod should have been responsible and names them to be like sheep without a shepherd. These words, that phrase, sheep without a shepherd, reflects the biblical indictment from God, Yahweh, who stands over against abusive shepherds who no longer take care of the sheep. The verses that are skipped over in today's reading, in the middle there, verses 35 through 44, that's the story of the feeding of the 5,000. So while King Herod is feasting with those who flatter him and with those who can do him political favors, Jesus is feeding the common people, 5,000, great crowds, as well as sharing God's good news and healing those in need. Perhaps the story of the feeding of the 5,000 is omitted and the healing ministry is only briefly mentioned so that we do not overly focus on the miracles of Jesus. In other biblical studies, I have pointed out that the miracles are never meant to detract from the kingdom message, even though the miracles can seem to garner the most attention from readers. Often people wonder why Jesus did not just heal everyone. And while that would have been nice, it was not God's primary mission for Jesus. Jesus came to preach and to teach about God's kingdom and about God's plan for salvation. Listen again to part of verse 34 from today's reading. As Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he began to teach them many things. Miracles were used when they demonstrated the teachings about God's kingdom and about God's plan for salvation. Jesus' mission is about the relationships. In Mark 12, 30 and 31, Jesus says, and we all know these words, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. And you shall love your neighbor as yourself." And verse 34, again, from today's reading, Jesus went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them. The Greek word for compassion signifies sympathy, mercy, and loving concern. Good deeds are important. It's important that we do good deeds. And more important is that those deeds grow out of loving relationships that we have with God and with others. The political leaders lack the compassion, the sympathy, the mercy, and the loving concern for their people. Their concern appears to be more about their own status and privilege, having banquets for their flatterers and their leaders and their other folks. And God's indictment of these shepherds can be witnessed throughout the many messages of the prophets and from Jesus in today's reading. Even though the people in today's reading have King Herod, they are like sheep without a shepherd. While Herod is feasting with his courtiers, his flatterers and officers and the leaders of Galilee. The first reading, the psalm, and the gospel reading for this Sunday all have obvious ties to shepherds and the difference between good shepherding and poor shepherding. The second reading for Sunday ties together with this gospel reading in that in Galilee, the people were from a mixture of cultures and backgrounds. And notice Jesus looks on the crowds with compassion. He never asks, "Are you Jew or are you a Gentile?" We have to make a distinction here on who I help. In Sunday's second reading, the Apostle Paul teaches us that God, through Jesus, has broken down the dividing wall. Today's good news is that despite what poor shepherds do, even those who hold positions of power, God is our good shepherd. And we can look to Jesus as our model, who we can imitate in loving God with everything in us and showing compassion to others through sympathy, mercy, and loving concern. Thank you for joining me today as we continue our journey toward the 8th Sunday after Pentecost, July the 18th, 2021. If you have a thought or concern or question, please feel free to leave a comment below these videos. And I hope you're having a great day. Take care. God bless.